All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience and for being here to see my talk today. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to telling you about my work in Philosophy Bites and the metaphysics of nothing. My name is Suki Finn. I'm from Royal Holloway, University of London, and I work in philosophy. And my email address, if anyone wants to contact me, I'm very happy to hear from you. It's suki.finn@rhol.ac.uk. There are actually quite a lot of links on these slides, and I'm happy for the slides to be circulated if you want to follow up on any of those links. So first I thought I'd introduce some of the areas of philosophy that I work in. It will be clear why I'm doing so as the talk progresses. So firstly, you might have guessed from the title of the talk, metaphysics is one of them. Metaphysics is the general study of reality. It's very abstract, and it kind of tries to take things one level deeper than physics, I suppose. So when physics is a study of reality and tells us what the laws of nature are, metaphysics will ask questions like, but what is a law of nature, and what does it do? Does it just describe the patterns, or does it govern what's going on in the world? So questions like that, taking things one level removed. I also work in logic, which is the study of reasoning, and how we infer from one thought to another thought, and what structures govern our arguments and can describe whether the arguments are good or bad. So that's helped me in life a lot. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know things and what knowledge means. Then there's the philosophy of science, which also does some of the things that metaphysics does. There's an interesting overlap there. And metaphilosophy and methodology, where metaphilosophy is philosophizing about philosophy itself and thinking about the methodologies that we use in philosophy. And also then applying that philosophical toolkit to other domains that might not necessarily ordinarily be within the philosophy curriculum. It was pointed out to me some time ago when I started working in philosophy that I'm a woman, which I already knew, and that as a woman, there are certain areas of philosophy that I really ought to cover, namely feminist philosophy. And my response to this was, as a feminist, I should be able to do any area of work that I like. And I have actually started doing feminist philosophy now. It's one of my main areas, and I love it, and I think it's open to everyone being a feminist and everyone doing feminist philosophy, not just the women. But this really got me thinking about what ideas that women have are kind of sidelined as just ideas that they have because they're women. They're thinking about feminism because they're women, or they ought to be doing feminism because they're women. And I wanted to highlight, actually, that there are women philosophers who do such a broad range of philosophy, not just me, in these other typically male-dominated arenas. And that's what got me into doing the book that I was invited here today to talk to you about, my Women of Ideas book, which I'll introduce in a moment. And also, just as a disclaimer, I've also worked on the philosophy of pregnancy, gender and love, but that's, I think it should be, completely independent of what gender I am. Okay. So, Women of Ideas, this is my book. It's based on the Philosophy Bites podcast, which maybe some of you have heard about before. Philosophy Bites, that's the logo. It's a famous duck-rabbit picture. Depends on which way you look at the image, whether it looks like a duck or whether it looks like a rabbit, and that's meant to be something like an optical illusion, something that we can think about in the philosophy of aesthetics, at least. So, Philosophy Bites, the podcast, is run by Nigel Warburton, who's the guy with the glasses, and David Edmonds, who is sitting on the sofa there next to him. And Nigel and David have been doing this podcast for many years now, and it's really successful. It's had over 40 million downloads worldwide. I know people that have been listening to it all over the globe, and of all different ages as well, because it's philosophy that's made accessible in bite-sized chunks. I guess that's why it's called Philosophy Bites, because it's these short episodes that you can easily digest. And so I was invited to edit this book and look at the archive of the Philosophy Bites podcast and select the ones that are, some of them that are written by women, and put them together in a book. Now, of course, there was too many to select all of the ones that are done by women and put them in a book. So I had to find 30, and I'll show you the contents list in a moment so that you can see the breadth of topics that are covered there. And the title of the book, Women of Ideas, I got from, or together with Nigel and Dave, we got from the BBC series, which is a philosophy series called Men of Ideas. And this philosophy series interviewed notable philosophers from the time, from like the 1970s, 1980s. And all of the people that were interviewed on this series were men, apart from one, the amazing Iris Murdoch. But still, there are more women than that. Even though we are underrepresented statistically, there was still, there are more ideas and more women than just the one that they had on the programme. And calling it Men of Ideas just only reinforces the idea that women don't have them. Women don't have the ideas, only men do. And so that's why the book is titled Women of Ideas. It's kind of challenging that history of being underrepresented and silenced. And of course, this idea of groups being marginalised from certain arenas, this isn't just restricted to gender. We see this particularly in academia and beyond with race and ethnicity and with disability and with the LGBTQIA community. So I've tried to address that in my book as well, that despite the title being Women of Ideas and really highlighting the gender aspect, there are certainly lots of other fights to fight and better representation to be had. So here's the contents of the book. As you can see, there's lots of different topics there, not just feminist philosophy, as I was told in my early years, that women work on feminist philosophy only. There's metaphysics there, like what I do. There's ethics, aesthetics, political philosophy, philosophy of language, some logic, some meta-philosophy, history of philosophy, Eastern philosophy, philosophy in Africa, all sorts. And I'm going to be presenting, actually, about hosting a panel tomorrow at the Cheltenham Literature Festival about this book. And I'm going to be joined by, I hope. But if there was nothing for me to talk to you about, then I would just stop the presentation now. So there are different ways of using this term. And not only are they different ways, they're completely contradictory ways. One understanding of nothing is that it is a thing, and the other understanding of nothing is that it's the absence of a thing. There is no thing. So I find that quite interesting, that it can be either the absence or an entity in itself. So what's the point of thinking about nothing? Why do I do this? Well, I think it's important to note what the nothing is, because it has explanatory value. It causes things. When we think about absences, we notice them. There's like a presence of an absence sometimes. If you're expecting someone to be here and they're not, you notice that. And when there's a hole in the bucket, water runs out, and you explain the water running out of the bucket because there's an absence, there's a hole in the bucket. So these absences, these nothings, these kind of negative entities, they do work in our reality and therefore are worth investigating and thinking about. Then think about some of the popular phrases that we hear about nothing, there's, you can't get something from nothing. That's often used in relation to arguments for the existence of God or some first cause about how did we get to be something if there was nothing before the Big Bang or something. But if you understand nothing as a thing, then when you say you can't get something from nothing, well, you can if nothing is a thing. So it's a bit of a play on words there. And the same with why is there something rather than nothing? Well, again, if nothing is a thing, then you can get something from nothing. There is something rather than nothing, because nothing is also something in itself. So again, lots of tricks that you can do with language, and I'll show you one from some more popular culture later on. So nothing is a special sort of object. It's a contradictory object. It's a thing, so it's something, but it's also the absence of things, so it's not something. So at the very same time, it is something and is not something. A straightforward contradiction. There's no way around that, of paraphrasing that so that the contradiction doesn't occur. It is a contradictory object. And in philosophy, and maybe also beyond, contradictions are scary. People shy away from them. They don't like things to be one way and also not the other way. It has to be one or the other. Things are mutually exclusive. But for me, I embrace them. I find contradictions and these sorts of paradoxes and complexities everywhere in our reality. And I think they're interesting to focus on rather than deny. Here's some quotes from a couple of people that I have been inspired by, especially Graham Priest, the second quote. So here's, first of all, Heidegger. What is the nothing? Our very first approach to the question has something unusual about it. In our asking, we posit the nothing in advance as something that is such and such. We posit it as a being. But that is exactly what it is distinguished from. Interrogating the nothing, asking what and how it, the nothing, is, turns what is interrogated into its opposite. So the question deprives itself of its own object. So when we start asking questions about what is nothing, we are assuming that there is something that we are asking a question about, but the thing that we're asking a question about is the absence of things. So in talking about it, we kind of bring it into existence in order to deny that there is something about it. So there's this kind of paradox of non-being going on there as well. And Graham Priest says, nothing is a contradictory thing. It both is and is not an object. It both is and is not something. And that's from his paper, Much Ado About Nothing. And here's that promise I made from earlier that I'll give you a more popular example of where this wordplay happens. So in Alice in Wonderland, you might note that Lewis Carroll, or Charles Hodgson, I think, Dodgson, thank you, was a philosopher, a logician, a mathematician, as well as a writer. And you can really see that logical, philosophical voice coming out in his works. For example, in Through the Looking Glass, just before Alice's encounter with the lion and the unicorn, Alice comes across the White King, who is waiting for a messenger. When the king meets Alice, he says, "Just look along the road and tell me if you can see the messenger." Alice says, "I see nobody on the road." And the king replies, "I only wish I had such eyes, to be able to see nobody. And at that distance too. Why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light." So there again, we see the different meanings of the nothing coming out, because on one understanding, it's a thing, it's an absence that you can talk about and see in the distance. But at the same time, it's the absence of something that is not there. It's not there. So here, no body is that there is not a person there, but in order to see that there is no person there, Alice says there's nobody there, but nobody being perceived as an entity in itself gives that contrast class of the meaning to nothing, where you use it to describe or refer to an entity in itself. And that again is something from Graham Priest. So one particular type of nothing that I've been interested in and have written about before is holes. I already gave you the example of a hole in a bucket. Holes do work, they do things in the world, they explain things, and they're undeniable. We have black holes, we have potholes in the road, we have golf holes, holes in one. There are so many, and lots of rude holes, but I'm not going to mention those. And holes are very fascinating and can also be very important. And this is a news report about holes in America for the 2000 election. So it's a bit dated now, but I find it very humorous. I'm going to play it to you in a moment. And it's with respect to how we identify holes and how we count them. And it brings out all of these philosophical quandaries about how difficult it is actually to identify holes as nothings in a way, as absences, and how to count them, how to individuate them. And this is with Professor Achille Varzi, who is an expert on holes. Hopefully this will work. Oh, I actually didn't mean to do that. I can do it straight from...
Were or were not punched in those ballots. Now, this prompted an investigation by our own Jeannie Mose. What she found.
For days on end, you've watched the story. Now we bring you the whole story.
This is a beautiful one.
From Swiss cheese to tunnels. From funnels to colanders. Other guys may appreciate a hole-in-one, but Achille Varzi is at one with holes.
Okay, this is a prototypical hole. Take this one. Is this one single split hole, or is it two holes? In this case, the shape seems to matter a lot.
Professor Varzi teaches philosophy at Columbia, and he's co-authored a book about holes called Holes and Other Superficialities. Note the cover.
This is a book that comes with its own subject matter, some samples of what it is about.
Imagine Professor Varzi's reaction when ballot counters checking holes ended up being front-page news. The humble holes not so humble anymore.
All of a sudden, we realized that the destiny of the United States, if not the destiny of the entire world, depends on our criteria for counting holes.
Down in Florida, they call this the sunshine test, though it's generally performed on ballots, not Swiss cheese.
Is this one hole or two, right? Are they two holes that merged?
After an hour with Professor Varzi, you may never suck a lifesaver.
The hole goes out of existence anyway.
Or munch on a donut without pondering the metaphysics of holes. This is a philosopher who finds meaning in munchkins, the so-called donut hole treat.
These are the parts that have been removed from the donut before it became a donut. Now, of course, this is not the hole. The hole is what's not there anymore.
But donuts pale compared to ballots
that have yet to be counted in the state as a whole.
Did she say whole?
And of course, then we have the crucial one. Is this a hole or not?
Maybe all the talk of hanging Chad has your eyes as glazed as donuts.
Would this be a donut with the hole filled?
Chad, at least, has fewer calories. Remember how George W. got in trouble referring to a hole? At least the hole is something the American public can get behind wholeheartedly.
Half of a hole or a whole hole?
Jeannie Mose, CNN, New York.
I have a...
So let me... Yeah, so there you can see. Holes make the news. It's important research. I hope you enjoyed that. For those who weren't able to see that maybe through the stream, then hopefully you can find the link. Okay, so let's talk about the donut hole a little bit more. As Achille Vasi mentioned, the hole is what's left behind once you remove something from the middle. The thing that was in the middle and could be put back we'll call the guest. The stuff that surrounds the hole, the actual dough of the donut, we'll call that the host. So the guest can go inside the hole in the host. I hope that makes sense for now, that terminology. So how do we identify what the hole is and therefore individuate and count holes? So we saw also in that news report the advertisement of those munchkins and I think they're called Titbits or something in Canada or in America, which is the bit from the middle of the donut, and they sell that as the hole. But of course, it's what gets removed to create the hole. And we know that can't be the hole because you can't really put sugar on a hole. You can put sugar in a hole, and holes don't taste of vanilla. Holes are absences. There's nothing there. So we can't say that those things are the hole themselves because they have those properties that holes don't have. We also can't identify the hole with the host that surrounds it because they also have different properties. You can change the host by taking a bite out of it, and it's therefore a bit different now. It's got a different shape, but the hole remains the same. The hole doesn't get affected when you affect the host. So even though in order to find the hole, we have to find the host, because otherwise they're kind of unfindable, they're unperceivable. You perceive, in a way, the host in order to find the hole. We can't identify the host with the hole because you can change the host and it doesn't change the hole. It doesn't interfere with it at all in that scenario. So we've said that the hole isn't the guest, the stuff in the middle, the stuff that gets taken out to create it, and it's also not the stuff that goes around the edge, it's not the host. Here's another reason why it's not the guest, because you can change the guest. Holding the donut in your hands, it will just have maybe air particles in the hole, which are the guest at that time. But then you could also put the donut on your finger, like in the picture, and then the guest of the hole is the finger. So the guest has changed, but the hole hasn't changed. The hole is still the same, it's still there, nothing's happened to it, it's just got something different inside of it. And even when you move that donut around, the hole moves around with it. The air particles therefore change, which ones are inside the hole, but the hole is still the same hole, even when the stuff inside it is different. So we've eradicated another option for how we can identify the hole. I try to identify the donut hole by its place in space and time, its spatio-temporal region. If you imagine like a matrix that maps out all the places in space and time, you could say the hole is exactly where it is located. But again, those donuts are not fixed in space and time, they move around. And so that spatial temporal location changes even when the hole doesn't. It remains the same one. It persists over time and over change in location. So we're really kind of left without many options of how to identify the hole. What is the hole? And then, as Achille Vasi was mentioning, they're also difficult to count. So here's a few more examples of why it's difficult to count holes. Imagine that these are two rings, so a smaller ring and a bigger ring, and you put one ring inside the other ring. How many holes do you have there? One or two? When they are overlapping, ordinarily, we don't have that sort of co-location in our realities. You can't have more than one thing in one place at one time. So how could you count two holes there as opposed to one? Especially if you start twisting one ring in one direction and twist the other ring in the other direction, what direction is the hole moving in, given that they're both moving in different ones? So some curious puzzles that come around from trying to count holes. Another one was the merging situation, as we saw in the ballot papers. Is that 2 wholes, or does it become 1 whole because of the merging? Does it need to have a piece of material to divide it for it to become 2 things? And with regard to shape, does the shape matter? You could see whether having like something connecting the material from from the top to the bottom, do you then have 2 separate holes on each side, or is it 1 hole that's split in 2? Or what about thinking about it the other way, where you make a slit in something, you cut something, if it's just something goes straight up and down, doesn't really have the shape of a hole. So does the shape matter? Does it have to be something that's more rounded? So all these curiosities that come about just from trying to do something seemingly very simple, identifying holes and saying what they are and how many there are. Surely simple questions, but actually give rise to all these sorts of paradoxes, which I suppose isn't a surprise given that they're absences and nothings are contradictory objects. So thinking about donut holes also led me to ponder other philosophical food items. And so I went from doing my Philosophy Bites podcast on the metaphysics of nothing and talking about holes, and donut holes and bagel holes and polo holes, to philosophy of food, philosophy in general, finding lots more examples that I find to be humorous, that demonstrate philosophical puzzles or paradoxes through an ordinary food item. And this led me to write my next book, which I'm currently writing now, and I'm nearly finished with it, and I'm excited by it. It's called What's in a Donut Hole, obviously. And then the subtitle is An Other Philosophical Food for Thought. Here's a little description of it. It's a romp through a feast of deliciously vexing philosophical quandaries that arise from thinking about food, served up in 19 chapters of digestible vignettes for anyone who has ever eaten or thought, hopefully trying to capture everyone there. This book cordially invites you to take a seat at the philosopher's table and to think differently about food. Unlike other food books, there will be no health-based recommendations or diet plans. There will definitely also not be any recipes. I do provide, though, some recommended eating to go with each chapter with regard to what food item is being spoken about in the story. And it aims to be accessible and funny. And in each chapter, a food item will be used to demonstrate classic abstract puzzles and paradoxes in a contemporary and concrete way that will make the brain and stomach grumble. On the menu of bite-sized topics include the existence of donut holes, as per the title, the phenomenal taste of durian fruit, the infinitely divisible pizza, the potato-y constitution of chips, the identity of peas in a pod, the persistent ripening banana, the paralyzing choice of ice creams, and many more issues in philosophy from around the globe. Probably the most famous one in the book that's used in lots of philosophical discussions is one that describes the problem of vagueness, which is the Socrates paradox, which you may have heard about. It's how many grains of rice make a heap. Rice is a food, so I thought I'd use that one. So with the vagueness comes in as, is there a borderline case for when however many grains of rice can actually qualify as a heap? And does 1 grain of rice really make a difference between a heap and a non-heap? It's a bit arbitrary to say so, because you'd think 1 grain of rice doesn't make a difference. But eventually, if you keep taking away 1 grain of rice at a time from a heap, you will get to nothing. And so 1 grain of rice does make a difference, because that process of taking away 1 will result in a non-heap eventually. So that's probably the most famous puzzle that I discuss in the book. So there will be food for thought that is light enough to whet the appetite of the complete novice, yet also substantive enough to satisfy the keen philosopher hungry for a refreshing take on traditional themes. It's basically reasoning with seasoning. And the reason that I've chosen to use food for this next book of mine, rather than the serious work of interviews with women on Philosophy Bites, is because I want it to be accessible. I want philosophy to reach a wide audience. And food, I think, is something that we're all kind of acquainted with. And it's easy to have a picture in your mind of the food to make the philosophy less abstract and obscure. So I'm hoping it's a good entry point for people. So that's the end of my book sell. The book is available for pre-order, published by Icon there. And then the Women of Ideas book is published by Oxford University Press this year, and the link for that is there. And then the Metaphysics of Nothing was with Philosophy Bites, and that's the podcast website there. So I hope you've enjoyed my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions both from online and in person. And like I said, you're very welcome to email me if you like as well. Thank you. Yeah. I'm just going to repeat the comment from the audience just now about the case in a Hugh Grant film. It's actually a true story of a mountain in Wales that, according to some regulation, wasn't high enough, wasn't tall enough to be considered a mountain, and so it was just considered a hill or some sort of heap. And in order for it to qualify as a mountain, it needed to be a little bit taller, and so the people that lived nearby added earth from underneath it to the top in order for it to qualify. And that's, again, an example of how these borderline cases really show us the vagueness in some of our concepts and how little by little does actually make a difference, kind of paradoxically. And then I mentioned about some other cases like that in real life that have gone actually to court, you know, with Jaffa cakes being defined as biscuits or cakes, and there was another food-based one. I think it was to do with the burrito, whether that was a sandwich or not. So yeah, lots of fun cases. I'm going to go to a question here, if you wouldn't mind speaking into the microphone.
Hello. Yes, just a comment that this might seem like metaphysics, but without an application. But I worked in IT, and we were very worried about nothing, because sometimes you'd have databases which are supposed to have numbers or other values in, and sometimes the values would be empty. It'd be empty sets. We'd call them null values, and they cause tremendous problems in trying to process that data.
Yeah, the null set. I love the null set. I find it fascinating because, again, so many paradoxes can arise from considering set theories. Is getting a bit technical, I know. But yeah, thinking about how sets are constructed and how they're identified and individuated and how they can also multiply. I can imagine that brings lots of trouble for someone working in your area. And it's interesting that it's hard to know what needs to happen first in order to resolve these problems. Do we have to go back to the abstract logic, or is there a way of fixing it in the applied case first, which will then teach us about what's going on in the abstract logic?
We usually ended up cheating.
Cheating. Can't condone that, but I understand. And if you wouldn't mind as well.
Yes. Another food-relating one, I think it was on Radio 4's More or Less, about a tube of pasta as to whether it had one hole or two.
Amazing. Yes. Love that. The penne. Yeah. Is that one hole or two? Because it's got a hole on each end of the penne, but it's, of course, a tube that's goes throughout it. It actually might be very many more than two, because you might count one at one end, one at the other end, and then all of the slices in between. And you can divide up infinitely. So there would be an infinite amount of holes there. I love that example. I might use penne. If I ever present something like this again, I might use penne, if you don't mind. I love that. Thank you.
You can thank More or Less.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Oh, thank you very much for the kind comments online. Okay. Very good questions. Thank you. I don't have to answer. Where's the holes in finance? Do they exist? Let's go with saying they exist. And as with there was a question about when you have a donut, if you take a big bite of the donut, I assume you would bite into the hole and therefore break the boundary. You would break through the boundary of the host lining into the hole. Does the hole therefore not exist anymore? Have you eaten the hole? Think about when you're eating a mousse, like of some form. It's got all these air bubbles in it. Are you paying for nothingness in in your mousse, and are you eating the holes? And that's a very good question. And I suppose the persistence of holes through change, I wonder if the hole would survive but just become enlarged in that example, so that it's broken free from the boundary of the donut and joined up with some other kind of absences that existed outside of the thing. But then we're getting into physics and asking questions about whether voids really exist, and whether there really is kind of nothingness, or if the particles end up being something. So it leads into all these other areas, so it becomes kind of multidisciplinary. But yeah, excellent question. Thank you so much. Yeah, so that question was, what's the benefit of discussing holes? And I hope the news article showed one sort of application for why it's important, because we work with holes on ballot papers and in all other aspects of life too. But independently of those applications, yes, I do think it's just a fun philosophical problem to peruse. And truth is valuable in and of itself, I find. So the pursuit of any sort of knowledge, I think. Oh, thank you. Enthusiasm about nothing. Did you have a question?
I was going back a bit, actually, to your slide about your work on feminist philosophy, and I've done about that much philosophy. And I did a course at Richmond College down in London, and it was real beginner stuff. And I remember we talked about Mary Wollstonecraft and the vindication of the rights of women, and it just made me realise that, of course, especially with feminist philosophy, but with anybody, it's very contextual, because I was quite shocked at the views expressed in that, based on the context of the time. So when you teach feminist philosophy, presumably that comes out of what you're teaching. The idea that for each generation of women expressing the idea of feminist philosophy, it's different depending on where and when it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That is really important to contextualise. I think this comes out a lot in intersectional feminist philosophy, where we appreciate that there is no kind of universal woman and therefore no universal woman's struggle. Things will differ depending on where they are, what their circumstances are, what the situation is around them, and when this thing is taking place. So you're absolutely right that context matters a lot. And so the way that I teach it, I teach some historical aspects of feminist movements, and then I try and give critical accounts of pros and cons of different ideas and theorists. And then we end up thinking about particularly how feminist agendas and gender oppression intersects with racial oppression and oppression to do with disabilities and all sorts of other axes, so that it really does ensure that context, a fuller context is taken into account.
I suppose it's the idea that philosophy isn't an absolute truth.
Yeah, very much. Did you have a...
Oh, the only thing is, I don't know if this has been done with music. Was it Philip Glass, A Minute of Silence?
Yeah.
You've got people to pay to go to a concert, and they thought, well, what are we waiting for something to happen? And of course, nothing happened, because that's what they basically say, well, music comes out of nothing and out of silence. And it's like us, we all come from nothing and we go back to nothing.
Yeah, really, that was some excellent examples. Again, like the Penne one, was Philip Glass's 2 minutes 47. John Cage. Good one. Yes, thank you. Which is just empty. It's an empty manuscript, basically. It's to record the silence, and people will show up and pay to go and view it and pay for recordings. And of course, what ends up being viewed and heard and recorded is other atmospheric sounds, the sounds of the audience. And so you end up, there is something to it. But silence in music I also find very interesting as an absence, because that helps create a piece. I'm a musician myself, and I've inspired by thinking about music created or composed around the rests, around the silence. So the silence is important for bringing out. It is the centre stage. Yeah, exactly. There would be no music if you didn't have the rest. So yeah, I really like that example. And the other ones that you gave were came into the world through nothing, go back to nothing. We also came into this world through a hole. So I think, have we got time for another question?
Okay. Your new book, What's in a Donut Hole, you said that you want to popularise philosophy much more. And that's great because, of course, it's thinking about thinking, and also in the WA, it's sort of critical thinking as well. So we applaud that very much. So have you considered an alternative career as a stand-up comedian to further publish? To further promote philosophy?
I would. I think that luckily, I have the breadth in my career as it is right now to be able to give talks like this, do other public lectures, to write popular work, to do podcasts, and So I have some element of freedom to pursue being more public facing, which I find really important. I think it's a problem otherwise if academia stays in its kind of ivory tower and doesn't trickle down. The stakeholders of academic institutions are people that aren't in the institution, you know, taxpayers, and therefore we really ought to see our work feeding back into communities as a whole, and that's something I feel very passionately about, whether that's through comedy or through a book or anything. So yeah, thank you for your kind words. I'll go back over here.
Yes, going back to food, I always like to go back to food, but I suppose topologically we are donuts ourselves, because our food is never inside us, it just goes straight through. So.
Exactly. If you couldn't hear that, it was that topologically, the way that our physiology is that we started as a cell that flapped over to create a tube. We are basically glorified tubes. Things go in and things come out. And so food never really becomes inside us, is what it was said, because it just goes through. And so we're kind of like a penne ourselves, which further shows, I suppose, the relevance of wholes is we are them. And I think the majority of the universe, the solar system, is absence, and our bodies being made up of water, but also the gaps in between things. That's the majority of the stuff. So I think it's good to focus on. Thank you. All right. That's fine. Thank you, everyone online, and everyone coming today. Appreciate it.